Do we have a godless constitution? A godless constitution. Is America a Christian nation? Was it ever a Christian nation? Hi, I'm Pastor Dave, and thanks for joining this edition of The Final Hour. I'm excited to be with you. I had another topic I wanted to do on this episode. However, this is going to air on July 4th, our birthday, America's birthday. And I thought, I just cannot let July 4th come and go without taking some time and asking and answering those questions I just opened up with. Okay, do we have a godless constitution? Now, why would I ask a question like that? Well, I'm going to ask a question like that because, according to the secular media, what they say is the United States, is it a Christian nation, they ask? Well, not according to the founding fathers. This comes from the History News Network. This is something that was put out in 2019. So we've been believing this for a while. Are we a Christian nation? Nope. Not if you look at the founding fathers, they say. Now, the AP, the Associated Press, went even further with this. They asked, what does it mean to claim the United States is a Christian nation? And what does the Constitution say? Now, people who don't study this or understand this, that's a great question. What does the Constitution say? That's what we're going to kind of focus on for the next few minutes. I have several things I want to bring to you, which I think are going to really kind of shock you and blow your mind. And I can guarantee you the stuff we're about to talk about, you did not pick up in your time in school, in public school. Does the United States Constitution establish Christianity as an official religion? The AP comes out and says, no, flat out, no, the Constitution does not establish Christianity as a religion. So what does the Constitution say about religion then? Again, I'm reading from the AP article. It says, no religion test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States, and they quote Article 6. All right. Now, is that a true statement? The Associated Press is printing this, is putting it out there. In fact, I have another thing I'll put on the screen here for you. This article was picked up from AP News. It was picked up by a local NBC news station in Chicago, and they broadcast it as well. Now, I've only found the AP article and the article from from NBC in Chicago. I'm sure many other people, many other media outlets broadcasted this information. So the question is, what does the Constitution say about religion? And it says, no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification. Now, here's my question to you. Is that true? Now, if you say yes, let me ask another question. Is that how it was originally written? See, that's a big question right there. And this is going to change everything when you understand that. So give me a few moments here, because what many people believe now, I got to ask the question, do we have a godless constitution then? That's not the way it started out. Now, I am not going to spend any time today going through and giving you quotes from the founding fathers. I have no desire to debate anybody. I have no desire for you to say, well, so-and-so was a deist. Well, so-and-so was a theist. Well, so-and-so was a pantheist. I don't want to get into opinions. We can't go back and talk to the founding fathers. We can't ask them point blank, what do you or did you believe? We have their writings. We know what they wrote. So I want to stay just with the facts, just with things that have been written. I don't want to deal with any kind of opinions. And because of that, I'm not going to bring any quotes. I'm not going to tell you what George Washington said. I'm not going to tell you what Abraham Lincoln said or anybody else. I'm not going to go to Daniel Webster. I will actually use one quote if you want to do that. Patrick Henry said, I know no way of judging the future but by the past. Now that I bring that quote up because that's exactly what we're doing today. Where is the future of our country going? It's our birthday. It's July 4th. Where is the future of our country going as far as spiritually and our relationship with God? Prophetically, where is our country going? And Patrick Henry said, I know no other way of judging the future but by the past. Let's keep that in mind as we go through this. So we're not going to, again, deal with quotes from the founding fathers or anybody else. Christianity, obviously, has been around since Jesus Christ. So we'll look at 2,000 years. And just real briefly, in the last 2,000 years, basically, we have seen three different distinct time periods. The first time period of Christianity lasted about 300 years. And that was known as the time of purity. Now, what does that mean? Well, from the time of Christ to the apostles, from the apostles to the early church fathers, basically they took the Bible literally, and they wanted to do what Jesus said to do. If the Bible said to do this, they wanted to obey and follow Jesus Christ. They wanted to follow the scriptures. So that time frame is called the time period of purity. Well, that lasted again about 3 centuries. At 350 AD, you had a Roman emperor, Constantine. Constantine then changed everything. This transitioned into the second time frame of Christianity. This went into the time period of apostasy. Why would I say apostasy? If a Roman emperor, if the ruler of the world is going to say, okay, Christianity is the official religion, why would that be apostasy? Well, what happened was he decided that a king can say, all right, I'm the king, I have the right, everybody now is Christian. All the Jewish synagogues, all the pagan temples, whatever there was, they all now became, overnight, they became Christian churches. Now, the king had the ability to do that, and he did. But that doesn't change hearts. If someone says, okay, now this is the official religion, you have no other religion here, it doesn't change my heart. So this is why it's apostasy, because those in the pagan temple, well, they still did their pagan worship. Those in the Jewish synagogue, they still rejected Jesus, but they had to go now to a Christian church to worship. And they just brought their pagan beliefs, and they brought their unbiblical beliefs. They brought everything that they were worshiping before into the so-called Christian church. And again, when you had this was not a good thing for a relationship with Christ, because it just wasn't real. So that lasted about 1,200 years. So the first time, the time of purity lasted about 300 years. The second stage lasted about 1,200 years. And it gets us into the third stage, which we're still in. And this third period is called the period of Reformation. Now, many people who know church history will go, oh yeah, that started in the 1500s. And they'll throw out names like John Calvin and Martin Luther. And those were some key players with the Reformation in the 1500s. However, it started about 200 years before that. In the 1300s, people were looking at what we were doing. During this time of apostate, you would have the Catholic Church. Up until this point, there's only one church. Catholic means universal. There's only one church until the 1500s. So you had Catholic bishops, and they would form councils, and they would put decrees, laws in place. They would say, okay, this is how we interpret things. And that became what they believed was biblical law, religious law. And in the 1300s, people start saying, well, wait a minute. Why is the Pope infallible? And why do we have purgatory and Maccabees and Second Maccabees? And why are we preaching these things? And they said, time out. We need to get back to the time of purity. We need to get back to the time where we just took the Bible literally and we followed the Bible word by word. So this became the time of Reformation. And we have some leaders, but basically in the 1300s, in Switzerland, in France, in England, in the Netherlands, some godly men stood up and said, wait a minute, we need to get back. And that snowballed into the 1500s, when people like John Calvin and Martin Luther said, okay, enough's enough. And they protested. That's where the word Protestant comes from. They protested against some of the teachings and the beliefs of the then Catholic Church. So again, but what that took place, that thinking and that movement took place a few centuries before Calvin and Luther. So you have the time period of purity, the apostate period, and we're still in the period of Reformation. So just understand that. That brings us to America and our birthday. Obviously, that happened after the 1500s. In fact, we have to go to 1607 and the establishment of Jamestown. That really begins the beginning of America. 1607 and Jamestown being established. Then in the 1760s, 100 years later, a century later, you then have the 13 original colonies. Now, this is all history. I'm sure many of you understand this. So you have the 13 original colonies. There's some going back and forth on this. What we believe from 1625 to 1776, the 13 colonies in population, it grew from about 2,000, going back from Jamestown, to over 2 million. So America now is beginning to grow. And at this is where we start getting the time moving into the Declaration of Independence. This is where we have to have laws and government. So from 1607 in Jamestown up to 1776, 150 years later, we said, okay, now we have enough people, over 2 million people. We have to have structure. We have to have understanding. And here becomes the question. Is America a Christian nation? Or was America ever a Christian nation? Folks, I believe there's two totally different questions. Is America a Christian nation? No, I do not believe that we are right now. I do not believe we're a Christian nation now. Were we ever a Christian nation? Yes, I completely disagree with the AP in this article saying that we never were. And again, I'm not going to use opinions. I'm not going to use quotes because you're going to say, well, that man was a deist or this man was a pantheist. We're going to stay with documents. I just want to look at the documents. I do want to talk about some things. If you go back 50, 60 years, the kind of questions that we have now, the kind of doubts that we have now of our Christian history didn't really exist. Let's go back to the 32nd president, the 33rd president, and the 34th president. We're going to go back from 1933 up to 1961. And folks, 1961 is going to be a very, very important date. 1933 to 1961. As we look at this, okay, President Franklin D. Roosevelt, he was our 32nd president from 1933 to 1945. Do you realize time after time, he called America a Christian nation in his official addresses? You can look in the records of Congress. That's what I'm saying. I'm not trying to get an opinion. In the official records, it says that Roosevelt would say, America is a Christian nation. Well, he passed the baton to a 33rd president, Harry Truman, our 33rd president from 1945 to 1953. He was very important with the establishment of Israel, by the way. All right, so President Harry Truman, our 33rd president, called us a Christian nation. Again, the records show this repeatedly in official addresses, and that passes the baton to our 34th president, Dwight D. Eisenhower. 1953 to 1961, and after him, 1961 becomes a big year. We're going to talk about this. Again, time after time, in official addresses, our 34th president, Eisenhower, said, we are a Christian nation. So President number 32, 33, and 34, all in official addresses, repeatedly said we're a Christian nation. So we're saying, were we ever a Christian nation? Yeah, we were. Eisenhower is very unique. He was actually baptized while in office. To this day, he's the only sitting president who was baptized while in office. And Eisenhower was very unique with how he put his faith out there. He said faith, I will quote him. He says, faith was the single most important distinction between freedom and communism. Oh, okay. What's the biggest distinction between freedom and communism? Our president said it's having faith. Okay. Sunday, February 7th, 1954, Eisenhower did a radio address. And on this radio address, he emphasized the importance of godliness in American history. He took us through, he actually gave a civic lesson on this radio show. And he walked us through. He said, quoting from the radio show, he said, out of faith in God and through faith in themselves as his children, our forefathers designed and built the republic. Folks, our president is saying our forefathers designed and built our republic. That is February 7th, 1954. And then again, he gave a little civic lesson doing this radio broadcast. And what he did, he talked about the struggles of the Pilgrims and their signing the Mayflower Compact before they landed on the ground. He talked about the testing of George Washington's faith, at Valley Forge. And then he talked about Abraham Lincoln and the battles that he had to face and his faith being challenged as president. So again, he said on the radio show publicly, he said all of these men shared a steadfast belief in God. He went to the Pilgrims, he went to George Washington, he went to Abraham Lincoln, and our 34th president said the thing they had in common, they all shared a steadfast belief in God. Are we a Christian nation? Do we have a godless constitution? Well, today we do. but that's not the way it was originally designed. Again, I want to stay with records, not opinion. And you can go look, in fact, I encourage you to go look this up and research this. Let's look at some early state constitutions. Again, these are the constitutions. This is said, this is what our state believes. These are core values. This is a belief system. Going back to some very early ones, Massachusetts, very left-sided state right now, but Massachusetts in 1780, their constitution in 1780 required officials to declare belief in the Christian religion. Did you hear that? Massachusetts said, if you want to run for office, you have to believe in Christianity. What did the AP article say? It said that no one is required to believe in God. Well, Massachusetts, in their original constitution in 1780, said otherwise. New Hampshire. Well, let's go to Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania, 1701, even earlier. It's the Pennsylvania Charter of Privilege is what it was called originally. They promoted religion liberty, but they assumed that everyone had a Christian framework because everything they wrote in their charter had a biblical background and understanding. So they said, you have to have these beliefs if you want to understand what we're going to do in Pennsylvania. Connecticut. Oh, Connecticut is wonderful. Connecticut's original constitution said, get this, they said they referred to the Holy Bible as a legal authority. The Holy Bible is a legal authority. What is the law? Well, let's look at this, and this will tell us what the law is. That was Connecticut. Again, Christianity influenced the morals in America as we began. The American Revolution, going back to that time, back then you had the Black Robe Regiment. Now, the Black Robe Regiment was a kind of a backhanded slap at the clergy. The British came up with this term because there was the clergy who stood in the pulpits and talked about religious value, talked about religious freedom, talked about breaking away from Britain and being able to have the freedom to worship God. That's what started all this. And because back then the clergy wore black robes, the British kind of backhandedly said, well, that's the Black Robe Regiment. But what were they? The Black Robe Regiment stood up and said, no, we will not compromise. And it called the people in the pews to stand up for their Christian values and their Christian faith. We are not England. We are not British. We are Americans, and we will worship the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We will worship the God of creation. That is the Black Robe Regiment. History, not an opinion with that. Now, interesting too, the University of Houston, secular organization, secular university, they did some research. They were asking questions like this. Okay, who inspired the founding fathers? Who impressed themselves on the founding fathers? So the University of Houston in 2015, they completed a 10-year study. Took them 10 years to do this, and they gathered as much original writings from the founding fathers as they could. They had 55 signers of the Declaration of Independence, and they had personal journals, they had letters, they had writings, they had articles, and they had documents. They took everything they could. They gathered over 15,000 pieces of written document by the 55 men who signed the Declaration of Independence, and they said, okay, who did they quote? What was their influence? What was it when they had to make a decision? What was it they turned to gather information from? Again, the University of Houston, this was done by the professor of political philosophy in the University of Houston. They found that of the 15,000 pieces of literature, handwritten literature, 34% of it came from the Bible. What did our founding fathers use for inspiration? What influenced the founding fathers? The Holy Bible. 34%. Well, what's next? The next thing was 8%, and that was writings done by William Blackstone. If we have time today, I'm going to really go and explain who William Blackstone is. But that was the second influence. But it went from 34% to 8%. Overwhelmingly, the Holy Bible was what the founding father, again, this is the University of Houston doing this research on this. So again, the Associated Press says, does the Constitution establish Christianity as an official religion? They say, no, it doesn't. Well, again, let's look at some constitutions. If you go back to what our Constitution today says, It says there's three branches of government. We have three different branches. Well, that's Isaiah 33, verse 22, by the way. That's where that comes from, going back to the original documents. We have Article 1, 2, and 3 of our Constitution. Well, the founding fathers wanted separation of power. They wanted checks and balances. So Articles 1, 2, and 3 of our Constitution comes from Jeremiah chapter 17, verse 9. What about Article 1, Section 8 of our Constitution? This is to welcome immigrants. Now, George Washington had an opinion about that too. He wanted to welcome immigrants into our land for the purpose of evangelizing them. But our Constitution says that we should welcome immigrants too. They felt that that was mandated by Leviticus chapter 19, verse 34. Again, the Bible in our Constitution. Article 2, Section 1. The president, our leader, the president, it says must be a natural born citizen. Where does that come from? That's Deuteronomy 17, verse 15. Our Constitution is based on the Bible. Article 3, Section 3 of the Constitution. No one may be executed by the testimony of only one witness. Well, that's Deuteronomy 17, verse 6. Article 1, Section 9 and 10. If you commit a felony or treason, well, you lose your civil rights. So if you're a felon or you commit treason, you can't vote. You lose some of your rights. If your family members are involved in treason, they too can be found guilty for that. Well, folks, that's Ezekiel chapter 18, verse 20. If you donate to a church, if you tithe, if you give to a church or a nonprofit or a charitable organization, a 501c3, well, you get a tax write-off for that. Well, churches are tax-free. Churches can do that because they're tax exempt. Where does that come from? That's Ezra chapter 7, verse 24. And the last one I'll share with you is Article 4, Section 4, the right of representation in government and for all states. This establishes us as a republic. We are a republic. Article 4, Section 4, and folks, that is built upon Exodus chapter 18, verse 21. This is Moses instructing the Israelites how to select their leaders. It's all in our Constitution. But that's not what we're going to be told. And again, I'm not going to go back and look for quotes. I'm not going to go back where we can put an opinion there because we can't talk to George Washington. We can't talk to Daniel Webster, but we can look at what's been written. State Constitution, some more at this. 1780, Massachusetts. Massachusetts Constitution says it is the right as well as the duty for all men to worship the supreme being. This is part 1, Article 2 of the original Massachusetts Constitution, 1780. It says the leaders, the government shall require the support and maintenance of the public Christian teachers to teach religion and morality. We have to put Christian teachers in the public square to teach religion and morality. Part 2, Chapter 5, Section 1 of the original Massachusetts Constitution. New Hampshire, their Constitution from 1784. No person shall be capable of being elected who is not of the Christian religion. If you're not Christian, you can't run for office. So says New Hampshire, 1784. Connecticut, again, it's called the Fundamental Orders of 1639. It goes back, they entered into a constitution to maintain and preserve the liberty and purity of the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ. Connecticut, when we form a state, we are going to make sure that we maintain and preserve the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ, 1639. Delaware, their constitution, 1776, required all public officials to take an oath. Can you imagine anybody running for office, public office today, to take this oath? This is Delaware, 1776. It says, my oath has to be, I do profess faith in God the Father and in Jesus Christ, his only Son, and in the Holy Ghost, and acknowledge the Holy Scriptures of the Old and New Testament to be given by divine inspiration. So help me God. You have to take that oath in Delaware, 1776, if you want to run to office. It's a promise. It's an oath that I profess faith in God the Father, Christ the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and I will maintain that the Bible is divinely inspired. Oh my goodness, look how far we've come. Maryland, again, 1776. No other test or qualification ought to be required than of the oath to support this state is a declaration to believe in the Christian religion. You have to believe to be a Christian. No other oath or test will be required. You have to, the test will be, are you a Christian? No, I'm not. Well, then you cannot run for office. This is Maryland, 1776. South Carolina, 1778, 2 years later. The Christian Protestant religion shall be deemed the established religion of the state. Okay, how is this any different than what Constantine did when you go back to the apostate period? Well, the states are saying it's because this is what America is built on, and it's a fundamental belief. Constantine was putting things in place where it wasn't about Jesus. It was about, this is what I believe, so everybody else has to. The government here is saying, this is who we are. This is what our morals, our values, and our laws are written on. They were all based on the scriptures and who God is. You had to pass a religious test to run for office. Again, in summary, Massachusetts had strong Christian language. There was public worship in Massachusetts. And guess what? You had to pass a Christian religion test to run for office. New Hampshire, again, Christian beliefs and morals. And you had to pass a Christian religious test to run for office. Delaware, they required belief in the Trinity and in the Bible in Delaware. And guess what? You had to pass a Christian religious test to run for office. Okay, Maryland required belief in Christianity. And guess what? You had to pass a Christian religious test to run for office. South Carolina, Christianity is the official religion. And you guessed it, you had to pass a Christian religious test to run for office. The last one is Connecticut. Laws are based on biblical laws, and you have to pass a Christian test to run for office. Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Delaware, Maryland, South Carolina, Connecticut. All right, there's a timeline. Now, states removed. Obviously, states removed this religious test. Why and what happened? Delaware, 1776, they required beliefs in Christianity and the Bible. Well, that was overturned, 1776. That was overturned by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1961. Again, 1961 becomes a very important date. So we had Delaware saying you have to believe in Christianity and the Bible, overturned, Supreme Court in 1961. Maryland, same thing. The Maryland Constitution says you have to believe in Christianity, overturned in order to run for office, overturned by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1961. Massachusetts, again, 1780, they removed that 103 years later in 1833. New Hampshire, 1784, they said you have to be a Christian to run for office. They changed that in 93 years later in 1877. North Carolina, 1776, they said you have to believe in God in order to run for office. That was removed 59 years later in 1835. Tennessee is interesting. Tennessee, 1796, their constitution, the Constitution of the state of Tennessee, said it required belief in God and, get this, and in future judgment. You got to believe in God and in future judgment. Now, folks, in Tennessee, that is still in the books today. That is still in the Tennessee Constitution. It's just not being enforced. So it could be. If you live in Tennessee, check it out. You have to believe in God and in future judgment. Arkansas, Mississippi, Texas, Pennsylvania, various constitutions written in the 1800s required belief in God. All of those constitutions, Arkansas, Mississippi, Texas, and Pennsylvania, it's still in the books. Requiring a belief in God is still in the books. However, it's been unenforceable since, guess when? 1961. All right, what happened in 1961? Why is all this stuff happening in 1961? Well, there was a court case. Roy Trocasco was an atheist. He was denied a position as a notary in Maryland, so he took it to the Supreme Court. The U.S. Supreme Court then, on this court case in 1961, said that the states cannot require a religious belief to be a qualification for public office. So in 1961, the Supreme Court said states cannot use Christianity or any religion as a qualification to run for office. So all those laws that are still in the book, they're unenforceable since 1961 when the Supreme Court did this. So what is the big question? What was it that made the Supreme Court come to this? It's going to blow you away. I can almost guarantee you probably haven't heard this before. Again, in the late 1700s, in the early 1800s, most states you had to have a religious test in order to run for office. But by 1961, the Supreme Court said that was rendered unenforceable. So what happened? All right, in this court case in 1961, the Supreme Court looked at this And they came back and they looked at the Ten Commandments. And they somehow decided that we didn't have one set of Ten Commandments, that we had four sets of the Ten Commandments. Time out. Where'd that come from? The Supreme Court looked at the Ten Commandments and said there's four different versions. They said there's a Catholic version of the Ten Commandments. They said there's a Jewish version of the Ten Commandments. They said there's a Protestant version of the Ten Commandments. And they said there's a Lutheran version of the Ten Commandments. I don't know why Lutherans weren't tied in with Protestant, but that's the Supreme Court decided. So again, so there's a Catholic version, a Jewish version, a Protestant version, and a Lutheran version. So which one do we gravitate towards? Which one do we favor? And they said we can't favor one, so no religion is qualified now. This is what happened in 1961. Now you look at that and say, okay, Pastor Dave, I've never heard about four different versions of the Ten Commandments. That's because there isn't. When they looked at this, it had nothing to do with the language. The Ten Commandments were the Ten Commandments. They didn't change any of the Ten Commandments. They didn't take anything out. They didn't put anything in. All they did was they reversed them in order. They put them in different orders of importance. Okay, for the Jewish people, this is the most important of the Ten Commandments. For the Catholics, this is the most important for the Ten Commandments. For the Protestants, this is the most, and that's what they came up with in 1961. So because we can't pick the Jews over the Catholics or the Catholics over the Christians, we're not going to allow any religion. So all these state constitutions that required the religious tests of Christianity to run for office, they said are now unenforceable. So isn't that amazing? That's where our nation went. So you get the article saying, are we a Christian nation? Or do you have to run for office? That's where it all came from. How many people understand this? What version is it? By making this decision, they began making decisions from that point on, such as taking prayer out of public school. Taking prayer out of public school. When I go back, you go back to Boston, 1777. This is the Boston Primer. The very first textbook ever printed. It was done in Boston. It was done in 1690. This version is 1777. And this is the Boston Primer. This is the Bible. What they're teaching in the book, what they're teaching in the schools is the Bible. This in Boston, and from 1690 into the 1700s, this was for 200 years. From 1690 into almost 200 years, this is the only book that was really taught in the public school system in Boston. How about Texas? In Dallas, here's a Bible study course, the New Testament study course. This is what they studied in the public school system in Dallas, Texas. This is dated April 23rd, 1946. 1946. So we have God in the public schools in 1946. We have in Boston, we have in Dallas. This is what our kids are being taught. And in 1961, the Supreme Court says, well, we see four different types of Ten Commandments, so none of this is allowed anymore. And they start making decisions such as taking the Bible out of public school, taking prayer out of public school. In the 70s, you get into abortion. And now we get into gender. We get into same-sex marriage. It just goes from there. So 1961 is a huge date. So let's say how it worked out. Somebody say, well, I want to go do my thing and not do God's thing. I say, okay, well, let me know how that works out. Come back in 6 months or a year and tell me how that worked out. So let's look from 1961 on. How has that worked out for America? Real briefly. Again, I'm going to throw some stats at you. The rise in crime from 1960s to 1990s. 1961, violent crime. The violent crime rate in 1961 was 158 people per 100,000. 158 versus out of every 100,000. By 1980, less than 20 years, that went to 597 per 100,000. It tripled. By 1991, it was 758. It was more than 4 times the increase. Violent crime, and numbers today is they've been hard to come up with now because many crimes not even reported. But just from the 60s to the 90s, violent crime quadrupled. Well, yeah, let's take God out of the thing. What do you think? Hard drug use. Hard drug use peaked in the 1970s and again in the 1990s. High school, in 2008, high schoolers were they asked the 12th graders how many of them had experience with hard drugs. We're not talking about marijuana, we're talking about hard drugs. In 2008, 12th graders, 47%, just less than half, said they had tried to experiment with hard drugs. Those are the ones admitting it. By 2023, that number had jumped to 62%. So we went from zero in the 60s pretty much, 70s it kicked in, 47 by 2008, and 62% by 2023, hard drug use. How about marijuana? That's legal now in some states. Well, in 1969, less than 4% of Americans even ever tried it. 1969, less than 4%. Then you get into sex, drugs, and rock and roll in the 60s and 70s. By 1972, the people who tried marijuana went up to 12%. That doubled by 1977, again, the 60s and the 70s. In 1992, almost daily, 1 million people were almost using marijuana on a daily basis. By 2002, 17.7 million people were confessing to using marijuana daily. And this was the first time where marijuana was used on a daily reference where it surpassed the daily use of alcohol. More people were using marijuana than they were drinking alcohol. This happened in 2002. Again, let's take God out of the public square. Let's look at 4 different 10 commandments and say we're not going to follow any of them. Overdose deaths. 1968, the rate was 2.5 people for every 100,000. 2 people, 2.5 out of every 100,000. 1968. By 2022, it was 33 out of every 100. So from 2 to 33. It's just amazing what happened with overdose drugs, overdose death. So crime, violent crime, drug use, overdose, people overdosing on drugs just took off. Now, discipline in schools. Discipline in schools in the 1960s. The biggest discipline was being disobedient. What was that? Refusing to follow teacher's instructions. Teacher says do something, you didn't do it, you were disciplined. Disrupt your behavior. What was that? It was talking in class. Being noisy or causing distraction in the school setting. Truancy or skipping class, that led to detention. If you missed a class, you were in detention. Dress code violations. They had dress codes in the 60s, and it included improper hairstyle. Could you imagine today if that was in place? Cheating or academic dishonesty, you were dispelled for that. Minor offenses was talking back to teachers, and that was a harsh discipline. You talked back to a teacher or administrator, you were dealt with harshly. How about today in our public schools? Well, now we have drug use, we have physical aggression, we have weapons, we have vandalism, we have theft, we have people afraid to go to school, we have school shootings, and we need metal detectors in our schools. Let's take God out of the classroom. What do you think? Again, laws that were based on the Bible: murder and homicide, thou shalt not kill. Theft and robbery, thou shalt not steal. Perjury and false testimony, thou shalt not bear false witness. Family, guardianship, and child welfare, honor thy mother and father. Adultery, which was illegal in some states, thou shalt not commit adultery. There was even Sabbath laws originally. We used to have blue laws. A blue law was there was no business were open on Sunday. Car dealerships, until recently, honored blue laws. They're the only one. You couldn't have alcohol on Sundays because of the blue laws. That was Sabbath laws. That was biblical. We had that. Charities. We had the church, people helping out, not the government. We had charity. We have biblical churches stepping up and doing things. So basically, right now, our modern day laws, by kicking God out of everything, our modern day laws are built on secular reason, social needs, not in the Bible, not in the Bible. I want to end with one more thing. If you give me a few more minutes, Blackstone Law. We talked about what was it that influenced the church, the church fathers. I mean, not the church, the founding fathers. The founding fathers, not the church fathers. When they looked at those, when University of Houston looked at their documents, 15,000 documents, it was the Bible and then Blackstone. Well, who was William Blackstone? He wrote the commentaries on the laws of England in 1765. And from 1765 to 1769, he wrote the laws of England. And these laws are still what they use in law school today. Lawyers and attorneys, they still reference William Blackstone's laws. So they're still very valid today. They had a huge influence on U.S. law, the right to have property. The Fifth Amendment talks about protection of private property. That goes back to Blackstone. Blackstone's idea that it's better for 10 guilty persons to escape than one person to suffer innocently. So we don't want one person to be put in jail innocently. We'd rather have 10 guilty people escape. That was what Blackstone believed. It was the presumption of you're innocent until proven guilty. Well, that's been turned on its head. You had no one is above the law, including kings. You had separation of powers. That all goes back to Blackstone. You had the right to a fair trial, a speedy trial, due process. Goes back to Blackstone. Say that real fast. You had the sanctity of life, and you had property rights. All this goes back to Blackstone, which is still in the books. Now, here's what's interesting. Charles Finney was going to be an attorney. He was studying Blackstone. He read so much of the Bible by studying the commentaries on Blackstone that if you know Charles Finney, he became an evangelist, became a pastor. Many pastors started out in pre-law. And when you look at Blackstone's commentaries, there is so much Bible in Blackstone's commentary that many people become Christians. They end up receiving Christ as their Savior by studying law. Isn't that amazing? Again, we go back to, is America a godless country? Do we have a godless Constitution? Well, we do now. 1961, things changed. But that's not the way things were original. Today is July 4th. It's our birthday. Let's really celebrate our birthday by understanding our true, original history, not the garbage that comes out by the Associated Press. All right, I am out of time for today, so thank you for spending this time with me. As always, we really want to try to resource you and give you something for free. So I'm going to ask you to go to Interpreting the Times and sign up for our weekly newsletter. Every Tuesday, we put out a newsletter. Now, you might say, oh, another email newsletter. I get it. I mean, we're trying not to do that. This is designed to really resource you. It's tied into 3 sections. What we do, we have the very first section, and I take a topic that's happening now. We take a real-time topic, and we look at it from a biblical perspective. So there's things that are happening in the world today. We deal with it, and this is how you look at it from a biblical perspective. That's how sermons used to be. People used to want to go to church to hear a sermon based on what was happening in the world. I have sermons in my file going back to the Great Fire in Boston, the Great Fire in Chicago. I even have one on the railroad system in Kansas City. Apparently, that was a big deal to the people at the time. They wanted to hear from the pulpit, what does God say about this? The sermon on the railroad goes back to the God using chariots in the Old Testament. It's pretty interesting. But anyhow, what we try to do is resourcing you is we try to give you, or we do give you, a topic. Then section 2 is headlines. We take about a dozen headlines every week and we show them to you from a biblical perspective, but we show Bible prophecy, what's going on in the world. And we keep it to 12. Some weeks I could do 50 realistically, but we keep it to 12. We show you the headlines. We say, this is what it's doing biblically. And the last section really is something that I hope that you can file away. The whole purpose of this newsletter is that you get it and you file it away and you resource it. So when stuff comes up, you have a tool, a resource to go through. The last section really is a Bible study or a sermon. It's written out for you. We're going to begin with the book of Isaiah. We're going to go chapter by chapter through Isaiah. So if you want understanding of that, if you look at some past newsletters, we just finished Malachi. We went through the minor prophets. So we each week I give you a Bible study, a sermon notes, detailed. I mean, the whole thing, 12, 13 pages every week. It's a lot of reading, but it's designed to give you a resource. So anyhow, we want to give that to you for free. All you got to do is go to Interpret the Times and check on our newsletter every Tuesday. It comes out into your box. I'd love to have you open that and give me some opinions on that. So again, happy birthday, America. It's July 4th. I'm Pastor Dave. If you're in the Phoenix area, I pastor Standing Stones Community Church. We'd love to have you worship with us. If you're not in the Phoenix area, interpretingthetimes.com. We'd love to have you follow us. Go on YouTube, support us, like, subscribe, everything else, all the social media stuff. But interpretingthetimes.com or Standing Stones Community Church in Phoenix, Arizona. I look forward to seeing you again in 2 weeks. Between now and then, I trust and I pray that everything you do is for the glory of God. God bless you.